I just want to talk a little bit before we start about what mixing really is. These guys wanted me to get right into it and say, this is how I do the kick drum, and I can see them at the back, rogue presenter. But I want to talk for just a minute about what mixing really is. You know, fundamentally, mixing is about musical balances and tonal balances. And by tonal balances, musical balances are obvious. By tonal balances, I mean the hopefully somewhat natural distribution of the frequency content in the instruments that are represented in the mix, which gets towards the idea of a great arrangement will make a great mix, as you guys probably know. If you're fighting the arrangement, if people haven't apportioned those frequency areas properly by using the right instruments pitched in the same way, right way with the right timbre, you're fighting an uphill battle. And I think that's what a lot of us do at least half the time, is sort of trying to untangle something that might have been arranged a little bit better to begin with. But so be it, that's what it is. But again, musical balances, which are obvious, tonal balances, which is, again, a very complementary and pleasant distribution of the frequency content between the different instruments, so the listening experiences becomes pleasurable purely from a sonic point of view. You know, creating a vibe is important. And I'll be honest with you, often if you create a deep enough vibe, you don't have to worry about all the other stuff I talked about, because that's what's really important. But yeah, creating a vibe. And seeing the artist and producer's vision. I can't emphasize that enough. If you're mixing for yourself, that's one thing, but if you're mixing for other folks, it's not for you. It's not for you, and you really need to go to the wall in several ways. To A, try to suss out what really the artist and producer had in mind, and then B, through your own chops, try to elevate that and take that to a level that they kind of didn't really imagine that it could go there. But it's real important to remember that it is not for you. If you're mixing, you're in service of the music, the producer, and the artist. And then this sounds real mundane, but the X factor. Can I hear everything? I know that sounds really kind of mundane, but that's what I've been fighting all my life. Wow, I labor under the assumption that if somebody put something in a production that they meant it so you heard it. Now it has to be in the right proportion, but I'm assuming that they put it there so you would hear it. I've been wrong, but you know, just can I hear everything can become a lifetime question in itself. And if you can put together a mix where you can actually hear all the elements, you know, meaning that they're in the proper perspective, but you can still hear everything, you're probably going to be pretty far ahead of the game. You're probably going to be doing pretty well. Now, some things will be darker, some things will be smaller, some things will be bigger. But if you can hear all those things, it's like, wow, that's really something in itself. You know, it's tough when you start thinking about the tonal balances, the musical balances, the artist's vision, the producer's vision. Can I hear everything? Did they intend to hear everything? It becomes a pretty complex matrix pretty quickly. And then there's the vibe factor, which I have to say I suffered for a long time feeling that if everything else was together, that the mix would be great, but the vibe was suffering. You know, ideally, the vibe is going to be in the production. You shouldn't have to invent the vibe in the mix, but it doesn't always work that way. And in a perfect world, what you want to do is enhance the vibe that's already there. Take whatever vibe and elevate it, magnify it 4 times. Another thing, just to get our definitions together, you can think about the dimensions of a mix in 3 ways. Top to bottom, which is frequency content. Side to side, which is your stereo field. and front to rear, which is the depth of the mix. And the depth of the mix, the last one is really the toughest one. You know, top to bottom to get a pleasing complementary set of frequencies for all the instruments to exist in where it's pleasant to listen to. That's tough enough. Left and right, the stereo field, well, it's kind of an easier proposition. There's a reason we don't put the kick drum and the snare drum hard right, because it takes away the glue of the rhythm section and the punch of the rhythm section. Front to rear is a little bit more difficult, and we legislate the front to rear dimension of the mix via ambience generators, volume, and timbre, of all things. Generally, as it's something we forget, but in nature, as things get farther away from you, they generally get a little bit darker. There's a reason why, you know, when you saw the cartoons where someone's in the canyon and they go, hello, 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 hello. Well, you got to remember that as those things die away, they don't just get quieter, they actually get darker also, which is one of the reasons why a lot of delays had high frequency roll-offs, so each iteration of the delay would get a little bit darker. And again, it's not like what happens in nature is everything, because no, we're making a record here. We can do things you cannot do in nature. But again, knowing the issues of perception and front to rear perception, what makes something sound farther away, there's going to be a timbral element to that. There's going to be a volume element to that, and then there's going to be an ambience element to that. Now, the ambience you can think of as the ratio of direct versus reflected sound that you're hearing. And you do that by how much you're sending to the reverb, how much you're sending to the delay. But again, think about those three dimensions of the mix. And really, the last one, the front to rear dimension, is where things get really, really interesting, because you should be able to listen to a mix. It should not be like a flat piece of paper. It should almost... It's kind of like televisions now. I have a 4K TV in the city. I guess it's LED. It's real cool, but I tell you, I don't know how you guys feel. It's a little weird for me because I see this layer here, this layer here, this layer here, this layer here, and there seem to be all these discrete layers going back rather than the plasma, which I have upstate, which looks more like film, where you have that smooth gradation of things. Just there's no layers, there's only depth there. And I think that's one of the things we want to work towards in our front to rear dimension of the mix. I'm looking at my notes, truths. They really are going rogue presenter. But this stuff is important. Again, it's not for you. It's for the producer and the artist. Not that you don't bring your own thing to it, because that's why they came to see you. Careful of reference tracks, okay? Sometimes somebody will do a track and they play a Katy Perry track for me. They want it to sound like that. I'm sorry, you're not Katy Perry. You didn't have the best people in the world working on this production who are really, really good at what they do. You can't tell them that. But that's just a hazard of when people say, well, yeah, I want it to sound like this. Well, you're not Al Green, I'm sorry, you know. But some of the things that you want to start thinking about in terms of what your clients want from you, or what you want from yourself, because a lot of times you've been mixing your own stuff, you can think of splashy. We know what splashy sounds like. Deep, mysterious, vibey, punchy. In truth, you really often have to suss that out yourself, because your clients won't be able to tell you that. How many of you guys mix for other clients? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about, so I'm not wasting my breath here. You know, ultimately, a great recording is a compelling performance of a great song, right? Those two things have to be there before you have a great record. Whether you like what he does or not, James Taylor could make a great record on a phone because he gives compelling performances of great songs. And a lot of times what we do during the course of production and mixing is trying to elevate it, trying to get it to another level where it really becomes more compelling. I'm looking down my notes here. How many of you trust your monitors? Fewer hands than what I did before. Yeah, it's key, guys. You know, it's really key. And to be honest, there's a couple things you want from monitors. The term flat is bullshit. It's like nothing is flat. What is flat? I don't want flat. I want to know what's there without any exaggeration of any particular area. So ideally, you know, the most important thing for your monitors is that they reveal everything that's there to you. You don't want to work real hard on something, get somewhere else, and find out there was an anomaly there that you actually weren't able to hear on your speakers. The good news is that there's a lot of great monitors way under $10,000 now. You know, there's a whole class of stuff now, really between $1,000 and $3,000 that are really pretty good. But get to know and trust your monitors. It is your ears. Those are the most important things you have. And again, rather than being good or flat, it's much more important that you know them well and you know how the stuff will translate. Back in the 70s, guys used to mix on, there was a stereo speaker manufacturer called AR, and there were guys who mixed on AR-17s, these little stereo speakers with a 6 or an 8-inch woofer, 2-inch tweeter. Some people mix on Oratones. Some very heavy-duty mixers mix on Oratones. But they know the response of the speaker and they know how the stuff will translate. So that's super important. And in fact, if you don't trust your monitors, then that should probably be at the top of your save up for list. What do we have as our building blocks? What do we have as our tools? You know, really, there's two things in audio manipulation. There are gain control devices and there are ambience generators. That's it. Now, by gain control device, you say, well, what about an EQ? Well, an EQ is a gain device. It just boosts or cuts a very specific area in the frequency spectrum, but it's still a gain device. You know, you say gain control, everyone immediately thinks of compression. Well, yeah, but also there's a fader. It's a gain control device. And there's compression, and there's an equalizer. Again, it boosts or cuts a very specific frequency area. Ambience generators, reverbs, delays, flangers, choruses. Pitch shifters kind of come into that. There are pitch effects too. But when it really comes down to it, those are the only things you have at your disposal. Gain control devices and ambience generators. Pitch-based effects, to a certain degree, I put in under ambience generators. You know, what do we do with these things? Hopefully, number one, create a tonally pleasing sound, something that when you listen to it, besides the music coming across to you well, is really pleasant to listen to. And if it's boomy and if it's Jeep stuff and it's meant to be like that, it's going to be pleasant to listen to on that level. If it's a Barbra Streisand record, sorry, Mick, and it's real shiny and beautiful and pinpoint, and you know, that's what that thing is supposed to be, and it's very pleasant to listen to on that level. So again, is it tonally pleasing to listen to given the context of what the music is? In a way, it should reflect the natural sound of the instrument, but in this day and age, that's way down on the totem pole of importance because nothing is natural these days anymore. If you're doing a jazz record, yeah. Removing unpleasant artifacts. Okay, that's a big one to me. Removing EQ areas that when a certain pitch comes up, all of a sudden it gets really tanky and then goes away when that pitch or that dynamic level changes. Yeah, we want to kind of take those things away. And a de-esser is a perfect example of that as well. You know, digital is really unkind to sibilants. We know this. It seems to make it worse. Digital also, to me, seems to accentuate the anomalies in the different dynamic and pitch ranges of a person's voice. You know how a lot of singers will sound very even, real good studio singers sound super even tonally and dynamically throughout the whole range of their singing. But for the rest of us, a lot of times when someone sings high, it'll sound real nasal and squeaky, and then they sing low and it sounds real dark and boomy. Well, we want to try to take away those anomalies from getting in the way of our listening experience. And then to have the elements work in the genre and the context of the track. okay? And this is all the same stuff that I was talking about before, but the genre is important, and I'm definitely going to get onto some techniques in just a second, but the genre is really important. People ask me, well, what's your first line of defense when you think about where you're going with a mix? I have to say it's genre, and the sonic emphases of different kinds of songs are really very genre dependent. When I was coming up, I had a couple of different careers scoring TV and stuff before I started engineering. So when I first started engineering, it was in the mid-'80s, and I was doing a lot of dance records in the early days of hip-hop. Then somebody brought in a jazz record. So I mixed the jazz record, and because I'd been doing a lot of hip-hop, the kick drum was king, right? Man, did I mess that up. If you guys know anything about jazz, the kick drum's like, you know, in hip-hop, it's right here. In jazz, it's way back there somewhere. So genre is really, really important. What works for one type of music doesn't work for another one. You know, I wrote, carve up the frequency spectrum to hear things in a mix. Yeah, make room for other things, okay? I'll get into something in just a minute about resonant peaks. Most instruments, because of the anomalies of the recording process and the instruments themselves, most instruments have a resonant peak. It often changes with the pitch of the instrument, but it's often there throughout the different pitch ranges. And what you can do is raise up an EQ with a medium Q, not real wide like that, not too tight, just about like that, and then start sweeping it. And all of a sudden, you'll get to a point where you'll hear this thing come up like that, and you'll back off, and it'll disappear again. Well, you've just found the resonant peak. And I guarantee you, especially in the low end of things, especially between 400 and 100 hertz. If you do that with everything in your mix before you actually get to work, is sweep that EQ and find that resonant peak where it really comes up like that, and just pull that back in just a little bit, all of a sudden there'll be so much more room for everything else because those resonant peaks won't be masking the other instruments. It's a big one. It works really well. And again, you'll do a lot less boosting because you've cut out the things that are getting in the way of the tonal uniformity of the instrument, rather than trying to make up for it with a boost here and a boost here, and you're boosting everywhere except that resonant peak. If you go and take that resonant peak and pull it down a little bit, everything else will be a lot more evenly represented. Do you need to boost? You know, I used to read about guys like real experienced heavy engineers, and they say, I hardly ever boost EQs. I almost always cut. And I was like, wow, I could never do that. I don't know how they do that. And you know what? Now I find myself cutting almost all the time and doing very, very little boosting. If you can get to that, you'll find that your mixes will sound a lot smoother, a lot less harsh, a lot less lumpy. You know, yeah, you got to boost the low end sometimes if you want a little hump on the kick or the bass in a certain area. And yes, if you want a little more tap on the kick, if you kick up 3K a little bit, it'll give you a little more tap. That's something you're not going to get via cutting. But particularly with high frequency, it's going to be a lot smoother if you actually get rid of all the mid-range and low end that's making it sound boomy in that area. And if you pull that away, you'll find that the high end that's left is a lot sweeter and smoother than if you crank up 5K, which will take the enamel off your teeth, you know, pretty quickly. High pass and low pass. There's a whole school, and there are a lot of heavyweight mixers that send their assistant in the room before they go to work. And every element in the mix, they high pass and or low pass to take away anything that doesn't need to be there before they go to work. And particularly high passing is really, really important because there's a lot of, not subharmonic, but bass harmonic information below, let's say, 150 or 200 hertz, that it really adds up. When you listen to one thing by itself, you go, oh, that's not too much of that. But when you have 20 of those things with a lot of spurious information below 150 hertz that doesn't really need to be there, it really starts to cloud things up. So think about going in before you go to work, high pass or low pass, everything, And this is the way you do it. Say with a high-pass filter, you take the high-pass, you play the instrument, you loop it, and as soon as you start to encroach into the bottom of where you want, you find you lose that bottom like that, then back off till you get what you want again, but leave everything below that out of there, because that stuff really adds up and you'll be fighting that cloudiness a lot. Same thing with low passing. Not everything needs to be bright, and in fact, if there's a lot of 2500, 3K on a bass guitar, I'm not so sure if that frequency area is going to help me define the function of what a bass is actually supposed to be doing in a track. So think about that before you get into work. Gain control. Okay, everybody thinks about compression as it keeps things from getting too loud. Kinda. I mean, that's the radio station thing. You know why compressors first got built, right? For radio stations? Apparently, I'm not real technical like this, but back in the 20s and 30s, if too much voltage got sent to the radio station transmitter, the transmitter would actually blow up. I mean, there'd be sparks and fire and the whole thing. So that's where compressors first got started and why they were invented in the first place, to keep things from getting too loud too quickly. Personally, I think compression does a couple of different things in a modern pop context. Number one, it helps us keep a constant presence on something. And you know, it's not good or bad, but it's the sound of a pop record that we're used to things having a particular presence in a track, and that doesn't change. It doesn't drift away too much and come back and drift away. If it's meant to sound like that, it does, but it's always right there. Well, compression guarantees a constant presence in a track. The other thing that compression does for me, and particularly with vocals that I think is really important, is it enhances the detail of the low-level stuff. Okay, I often compress not for what it does to the loud parts, but because it's clamping down on the loud parts, I can hear all the real soft stuff. And that's where a lot of the real expressive stuff in a vocal goes on, all those little inside things that happen inside on a vocal. So it enhances the low-level detail. You can hear all the low-level stuff. The other thing we use it for is envelope modification, right? Modifying the attack, sustain, decay, elements of a sound. And most of that's done with percussion stuff and usually with drums. But it can be done with guitars and bass too. Let me put up a couple other things. Again, many of you, it seemed like most of you actually mix for outside clients. Tuning. It's not your job. It's a producer's job. It's not your job to sit there and tune somebody's vocal. It's not your job to figure out how far you should go on that before it sounds unnatural and takes all the life out of something. You know, so no, I'm sorry, don't sit there and tune somebody's vocals for them. That's the producer's job. Occasionally, if I get a track and they wanted a real smooth R&B background thing where it was real lush and smooth, yeah, occasionally I'll auto-tune some of the background vocals there just to give it that lushness, because no matter what you do, if it's not really in tune, you'll never make it sound super lush. Try not to, speaking of auto-tune, try not to slap it on and just put it on one setting. Personally, I use Melodyne, especially for my lead stuff, and I go through it note at a time. I do it by hand. I don't do it by the grid. I do it by my ear, because every singer has their comfort level. Singers, you know, the range of an acceptable in-tune pitch is like this. Everyone thinks that this is in tune. No, there's a range like this, and every instrumentalist or singer has their comfort zone about where they live. And if you've ever tuned a segment of a performance, what ends up happening is the stuff that you don't tune starts sounding really weird because you've taken the singer out of their sort of comfort zone on the pitch level. But one other thing about, you know, and again, DSP and conserving your resources is an issue these days, less so all of the time. Now the computers are much more powerful and plugins are much more efficient. But it's a good idea not to put auto-tune on and just leave it on. I render it to audio and then disable the auto-tune so the computer doesn't have to work so hard. It'll save you a lot of DSP. Everything will run a little bit smoother. Just couple more things. Organization. Professionals things don't happen to professionals. Oh shit, it just happened. I don't know what happened. No, that does not happen. How many guys back up? I don't see enough hands. Guys, always have 2 drives hooked up to your computer, always when you're working. Your A drive and your B drive. Work to your A drive, and at the end of the day, back up to the B drive. Do it every day. Do not even think twice about it. Don't do drag and drop. Don't use Time Machine. Time Machine is really good for system-wide backups, but it's real lousy for file-specific backups. ChronoSync I use. It's a great utility. Carbon Copy Cloner or ChronoSync, 2 backup utilities that basically, ChronoSync lets you say, I want you to copy from the Backbone folder, I'm working with a band called Backbone right now, on drive A, and copy that, anything that's new, to the Backbone folder on drive B, lets you save that as a document on the desktop. So if I worked on Backbone that day, and I'm ready to leave, I just double-click on that, I say go, it copies all the stuff over, okay? Can't emphasize that enough. And I know you know that you should back up, but you need to do it every single day, and you need to have 2 drives hooked up to your computer all the time. Save version numbers. Every time you do a major amendment to a mix, save it as 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. It's sort of leaving a trail of crumbs. How many of you guys have ever done something and realized that it was much better 4 versions ago? Yeah, it lets you go back and import stuff from those earlier versions real easily. It also allows you, when you send stuff out to your clients, you have a mix called I Love You Baby Baby 1.3. They send you notes on that. I have a spreadsheet, and I'm not going to get too deep into this, but it's a good idea to keep a spreadsheet with your current working versions, your client's comments on a particular version, and then what you did to change it, and then what the new version is. And send those comments back to your clients. If your clients write you and say, I feel like we're losing this lead vocal at times, I feel like there's too much reverb on the lead vocal, the kick drum isn't punchy enough, I copy and paste that stuff to a text document, and when I send them the revised mix, I put little check marks by those things and send them that text document back. 2 things. Number 1, it keeps me straight and makes sure that I actually address those things, and it'll bring up the confidence factor of your clients, and they really will think that you are listening to them and care. Anyway, it's, in a way it's manipulative, but in a way it's not. The trust of your clients that you're actually there to do the right thing by them is super, super important. That's what people will come to you for. We all get better at our own rate and our own pace, and sometimes it's faster, and sometimes you'd be doing this for 35 years and you still go home feeling like shit. Yeah, it happens to all of us. But it's really important that your clients know that you'll go to the wall for them. I have to say, I'm pretty good at what I do, but I really feel like my career is a result of my clients knowing that I will work much harder than they will.